Good morning. Sego. Bonjour. My name is Steve Loft. I'm Ganyanga Haga of the Haudenosaunee, and I first want to acknowledge that we gather today on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. And I want to personally thank my brothers and sisters of the Algonquin nations for hosting me and us here on this territory today. When Ryan first asked me to be on this panel and told me about the theme, I was confused. And I still am. And I hope to be more confused. But I did start to think about a tour I had done a couple of years ago of sites of petroglyphs across this land. For those of you who don't know, petroglyphs are rock carvings done by indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, some thousands of years old. And I think about the makers of those carvings, and some of whom would be my ancestors. And I think about them looking to the skies and reflecting on our philosophies, their cosmologies, through our stories, our traditions, our dances, our songs, but also looking, seeing where we're placed, and trying to articulate through what they make who they and we are. For me, making is fundamentally about relationships. It's our relationship to the earth, to the land, to the environs, and to the beings we share it with. It's our relationship with each other. And it's our relationship to the cosmos. Whether that's through earthenware vessels, through wearable technology, through the structures that we inhabit. The things that we make articulate who we are. Trying to place ourselves in a much wider, an infinite environment. Not all that we make is good or good for us. But at its best, what we make can become, like the petroglyphs, the markers of our civilization, in the best and truest sense of that word, and our legacy to the infinite. So I'm really proud to be on a panel today with three very, very distinguished guests who I'm looking forward to hearing from. In the interests of brevity, mine, not theirs, I won't read their full bios. I do encourage you to. They're very accomplished people. But I'll very briefly introduce them here and then go to our first panelist. Dr. Sandra Alfoldy received her PhD in craft history from Concordia University and completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Rochester. Her current research focuses on the relationship between craft and popular culture. She's currently at NSCAD, the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design University in Halifax, and I'm proud to say that she hired one of my best friends, so she has now, by extension, become one of my best friends. Then we will have Tom Bessai. Tom is a registered architect in Ontario. He is the managing director of the Design Fabrication Zone at Ryerson University, where I used to be. So again, I have an automatic new friend. And I've lost my spot. An institutional incubator focused on innovative digital fabrication practices and workflow. He is coordinating the construction and fit out of a new state-of-the-art workspace on campus, the Ryerson Future Lab, which I hope we'll hear more about. And then we have Valerie Lamontagne, who is an artist, designer, and PhD scholar researching performative wearables, bodies, fashion, technologies, and laboratory cultures at Concordia University, where she teaches in the Department of Design and Computation Arts with my friend Jason Lewis. So we're all instant friends. So please help me welcoming our panelists. And I'll pass it over to Dr. Alfoldy.
All right. The fancy clicker. We have a fancy clicker. We were just saying we feel like it's a TV show and we're going to give all of you cars. But we're not. Yeah, that's right, Ryan is. Thank you so much. It is such an honor and privilege to be here, and I will keep my remarks brief so we can move into the discussion portion, but I had to write them down as a professor of art history. I just conditioned. I just want to thank Remco and Ryan for the opportunity to be part of today. The idea right from the inception was a really exciting one, so I'm curious to see how it all unfolds. So given the title of this morning's panel, I have decided to call my own presentation Talking Making, and I just want to do that very briefly. I was really interested in the title of today's symposium, Unhanded. And I had a few questions about that. What does that mean? Is this title the idea of removing the hand from making? Or is the focus today going to be on how we talk about the hand and its role in the process of making? I like both these ideas, so in my brief 4 minutes, what I'd like to do is just go over both of them. So this session that we're on begins with the question, what terms do we use to describe what is done right now? I'm researching craft and popular culture, so I'm answering that question from a kind of popular culture perspective. But in my research for the book I'm working on called Craft Washing, I thought that's a dangerous title, I found that these terms are most commonly used. Oh, sorry, look, jumped right past it. Handcrafted, made by hand, artisanal, made with love, and small batch. But within professional studio practice, these terms are almost poisonous. You will rarely find these being used in that way. So there are really two types of craft washing going on today, in my opinion. First, I think within studio practice, professional studio practice, if technology is used, it is often described as facilitating the maker's vision. So there's an idea that technology is very positive, it helps, but the maker has not lost use of his or her hand. And although the hand is rarely foregrounded, it's the maker's originality, the creative vision, the thinking that gets the spotlight. On the other hand, within corporations and pop culture, technology is unacknowledged, and the hand crafted and the idea of crafting with love is what's emphasized, no matter how ironic, like Domino's artisan pizza for $7.99. Another question this panel asks is, what are the links to European traditions of craft, and how do they relate to a new, more broadly inclusive language? And I don't mean to be too negative, but the reality, in my opinion, is that still today the fields of craft and design history and studies are predominantly Eurocentric. Why? Because we constantly foreground European philosophers, European artists, designers, and concerns. So Enlightenment ideas around the use of the hand as part of creative making and technique still underpin our art academies, our art institutions, the way we curate, the way that collectors collect. So for example, I was just recently rereading Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Art and Handicraft from 1797, where he argues that the only route to a true work of art is, quote, compounding pure sensuality with intellect. And I think that's what we're talking about here over 220 years later. We're still debating that relationship. We are deeply critical, like Goethe was, of what he called mindless imitation, blind tradition, and complacent inheritance. If you are adhering to any of those, you're in trouble then, you're in trouble now. And he saw that this was a real problem in 18th century craft work. So I think we're still extraordinarily critical of that today. So how do we discuss this idea of tradition, imitation, and inheritance in the processes of making in the 21st century. Does unhanding reflect an increase in intellect? Is that what we're after? Or is unhanding a diminishment of sensuality? So, I'm curious about that relationship. And how do we apply this to a globally new and inclusive language? And I think there's the rub. We still are applying that. And so that Eurocentric imperative is still there. We haven't resolved the yearning that we always have to make and own beautifully handcrafted objects that can enhance our lives with the good old desire for cheap handcrafted items. So I wonder, when we talk about the role of the maker's hand, if we've just shopped at H&M, I just had to buy my teenager back to school. Well, wait, I had to pay for it. He bought them. But H&M is where the kids go, Forever 21, because it's cheap. They're not stopping to ask whether or not the maker's hands are involved. How much technology is at play here? What's going on in that relationship? Where's the mindless imitation, the blind tradition, the complacent inheritance in a global discussion? So the final question that this panel asks is, what is at stake? It's a big question. And not to be overly dramatic, but I think the answer, like Goethe used, is everything. He wrote in 1797, being worried about the Industrial Revolution and mass production leading to the death of art, he said, quote, "The perfecting of machinery, the refinement of handicraft and factory production bids fair to be the utter downfall of art." So if we unhand our world, are we still risking losing art? Or is this really just about control? That's it. Thank you. Thank you. Paper's down. That's right, next.
Okay. I'm going to follow up and give you, let's say, some terms of reference from the side of, from another sort of disciplinary angle. So I'm an architect by training, and I have always been very engaged and involved in technology in my work. So in a way, on this panel, I think that I will try to speak for the kind of evolving or changing role of architects and designers in the context of some of the new tools and strategies that are kind of in front of us as we try to decide in what way we work. How do we design, and how are we making things, and what's the relationship between those two things? So I guess I'll try to give you some concepts and strategies, and there are three little categories that I'm going to run through to try to sort of put some of this terminology and some of these ideas on the table that we can discuss. So one is, I think, most usefully looked at through the lens of, and this will be very quick, ideal projects. What are the kind of ideal digital fabrication projects as seen from the kind of architecture and design community? Second, just underneath those projects, what are some of the kind of preoccupations that I know some of my colleagues in here are engaged in? For example, James Hayes, who will be on the panel later, around technology and workflow. Like, what are we kind of looking for when we're working between the digital, let's say, and digital fabrication or making? What are the kind of frames of reference in that regard? And finally, very importantly, and this addresses a little bit some of the search that Remco was commenting on in the introduction. How do you turn an art engine that has a collection of small maker spaces into something that actually has larger spaces, et cetera, that can leverage a broader audience and a larger spectrum of work? So what are these, what are the kind of, what's the digifab ecosystem, let's call it, starting to look like? So let's just have a quick look at that, at some of these ideas. So ideal projects. Really, there's, in terms of the terminology coming from architects, there was always geometry, order, and meaning. And many of us on the kind of architecture and the academic architecture side can spend years unpacking these. Roger Khanna would be able to speak to this for probably a marathon session of 48 hours of just talking about these topics. So there they are, and they remain at the kind of foundational level in this discussion. Next, other ideas, though, have started to kind of permeate notions of local response and minimum use of energy. those that are interested in building science have been talking about these things, but really there's another dimension to this that's about the experience. So how do we start to make less generic spaces and more particular spaces? And these are tending to be done through the lens of technology. Performance versus behavior. We, as architects, we deal a lot with engineers, and we are always, engineers are very kind of quick to discuss the performance of buildings, the performance of the spaces that we occupy. I'm exploring a broader term that I think is more useful in the context of this kind of the sort of the unknown qualities that are currently in our design making, design fabrication kind of syntax, which would be behavior, not how we behave in buildings rather, but nor how buildings kind of in an empirical sense perform, but rather this relationship between, let's say, people, technology, space, a set of ideas, a performance. How are those kind of behaviors important? And finally, a couple of other comments. Redundancy has become a really important kind of thing that people are looking for in this design world. How do we create systems that are playful, that overlap in various ways? And finally, hybridization and interaction, two terms that I think are really will become very essential in the kind of syntax or lexicon of discussions around design and technology. So I'll run you through some very quickly some images that start to give you a sense of some of these ideal projects, and we can ruminate on which of these kind of categorizations they sort of represent or stand to exemplify. These are MIT Media Lab projects. You'll find that within this bandwidth of design and digital fabrication, there's a kind of what I'm showing represent, really they're not building projects, but rather these kind of experimental projects that are starting to be exemplary of some of these qualities that we're looking for. So I'm just going to run through some of these. This particular image the kinds of technologies that might be put into play with that, for example, this group Bott and Dolly have been working with, could start to leverage fabrication technology for the activation of a space very similar to this. And that gives you a little quick look at some projects, some example projects. I really won't take the time to go into those. Technology and workflow. So really there's a couple of quick things, and I don't want to belabor the discussion with these too much because they are somewhat technical. So really there's an interest in material testing that is kind of re-emerged in architecture kind of syntax. Material testing rather than just design, which originally on paper and then using digital tools. Computation and simulation, the idea that you're not only using computers to facilitate drawing and designing, but rather you're starting to take advantage of the kind of algorithmic processes in computers in order to make sort of self-generating designs, to make sort of generative systems, let's say, on the one hand. And then on the other, with simulation, the idea that you're able to test the properties of real material systems in computer programs. So rather than going out there and testing how something kind of performs or bends or flexes, if you can do a very accurate simulation of that, then all of a sudden it opens up a whole world of design possibilities. The other one that's very important these days, and that's really central to the discussion, let's say in academia around design and fabrication, is sort of feedback, machine feedback. Really what that means is when you sort of give over making to machines, robots, CNC machines, etc., what those machines give back, let's say their limitations and their capacities become really important in what you can and want to produce and the methods by which you work. And finally, so just I'll run through these quickly. Material testing, as it was done back in the day, that's from Frey Otto in the 60s. The idea of computation as a generative strategy on your left, being tested in physical materials and finding some parallel there. Feedback from machines. This is a very elaborate project that's being run from the ICD in Stuttgart, where you're using various combinations of robotic technologies. And finally, one last point that I didn't have on my first list, but really like networked activity. To what extent do you need to be in the presence of the tools, the fabrication tools, in order to do the digital production that would go into, let's say, an enterprise? And so this is an example from Martin Rees, who works at one of the kind of preeminent facade design companies in the world. the model on your right was done by hundreds of people working networked across the world on a kind of parametric modeling program in order to produce this kind of really, smooth and curvy building that's on the left. So those ideas are really, maybe on the technical side, but I think to kind of underwrite some of these discussions with what the people that are working in design between, hand and digital design and digital fabrication. These are the kind of things that they're researching and preoccupied with. Finally, a last sort of area of interest where terminology is also becoming very important, and this crosses over between the profession, let's say, and academia or institutions. Institutions including, I would say, as a kind of a category, the maker spaces that are, and maker fairs, et cetera, that are kind of cropping up in all of the cities in Canada and around the world. So what's a kind of digital fabrication ecosystem look like? What does that really mean? So some of the things to look for, spaces and devices for making, and how they sit together and in what relationship. So this is the very question that Remco was asking, like, well, if we have new tools and equipment, how is it going to be organized, et cetera? The devices themselves, this is from a guy, the term that he's using is the democratization of technology or the digital vernacular. James Stevens, he's very interested in taking apart laser cutters and putting them back together, making a CNC machine and packaging it up in a box and carrying it off to a site where he can work with people on site. The understanding of the kind of nuances of these machines, sometimes they're very simple and sometimes they become more complex, and what relationship we might have with these devices. Sorry, next one. There. Institutionally, the spaces that are getting created, this is a space that's going to be under the purvey of the Design Fabrication Zone, which is this incubator that I'm directing. And it's a pretty multivalent, like high-tech fabrication lab, but instead of it being locked in the kind of back rooms of a particular faculty department, it's open to the whole university. So we'll be dealing with a lot of the kind of questions about who will use the space and in what capacity. With that in mind, like, how are we teaching these things? What are the sort of shared spaces of learning around these digital tools? So these are some examples of what that starts to look like. Very hands-on, lots of people kind of around these technology and these technology spaces. An example of work on a site in the same regard, but here, a couple of other aspects to that. Could that technology space, that space of fabrication, become double as a performance space? So this slide on the left starts to look at that possibility with things like projection mapping and using these fabrication tools to start moving cameras and sensors and screens in some sort of configuration with people. And finally, the last slide is really, on this side, is really to just talk about, if we're interested in all these things, should it be, and is it happening in these back rooms, or do you need to start making these things kind of public in various ways through display? So this issue of display, performance, and those, I think, are at the kind of front door of some of these, what are currently kind of, obscure labs with lots of technical processes going on. So that gives you a sense of, these are the preoccupations and let's say the blind spots and the interest coming from, let's say, the design side and the architecture side in this area. So I hope that wasn't too long. Thank you.
And how do I go forward? Okay, all right. Hello, good morning. Thank you for having me. What thought-provoking presentations already. So I'm going to talk about fashion and technology. And I really wanted to present the landscape of what that looks like. And I thought it would be a fun exercise to give a visual compendium through the alphabet. So there's going to be a lot of visuals. And don't panic if we don't get to them all. Okay, so we got to one slide. There we go. Oh, we're at Z already. Okay, that was fun. Oh, so we'll go from Z to A. There we go. So a fun exercise. So why not? Okay. So really, and I just want to say my argument, or at least my reasoning for such a structure, is that wearables as a kind of epistemic culture doesn't have a hierarchy right now. It's not as if textile or fashion or engineering can claim to own it. And for me, that's what is both confusing and exciting about it. So let's go through it. Let's see if I have enough time. Oh no, there we go. We got a little mishmash. Okay, we're back to A. All right, so art. Important to look at art. Fashion tech, interactive garments, something that's existed for a long time. Oscar Schlemmer, triadic ballet, tried to articulate all of that. B is for biofabrication. So when we're looking at fashion tech, we really have to look at other fields that are engaging. This is the work of Suzanne Lee via biocouture. So she creates biological textiles and fashions. C is for collaboration. So we mentioned Anouk Wieprecht earlier on. She's really capitalized or really led the way to how a fashion tech designer could work with Intel, could work with Shapeways, could work with various different companies to develop things, could work with engineers. Of course, she's not the only one, but it's one example. D is for design. So we need good design when we talk about fashion tech. Montreal has Ying Gao at UQAM. She's one of the few fashion tech designers who are really approaching it from fashion. And so her work is very seductive, very considered in terms of the fashion landscape. E is for energy, something that is keen and key to our daily lives, something that fashion tech is addressing. This is the work of Pauline van Dongen. She's developing, this is in collaboration with Philips and also with Eindhoven School, a solar shirt, which is a kind of a platform, well, essentially to recharge your garments and making it somehow aesthetically, I guess the videos don't work, but that's probably good for time. F is for fashion. So fashion, as we know, is not just the garment. It's not just the item. It's also, it is a hierarchy. It is a kind of law system. You're in, you're out. This is the wonderful work of Otto von Busch. He's at Parsons, and he creates these performances with fashion police, fashion bullying. Are we in? Are we out? How do we fit into that ecology? Because it's, you know, a rough world out there. G is for gadget. I mean, God only knows, and Joey Berezowska is here, who's also a colleague at Concordia. We talked about wearables, and it meant all kinds of things, and then all of a sudden Apple, you know, showed up and said, hey, it's a watch, you know? It's a wrist thing. You stick it on your wrist, or maybe on your head, but perhaps not anywhere else on your body. And I would argue that it's larger than that, but that's a really important space for it. H is for health. So of course, we're looking to wearables to provide us with new ways of self-monitoring, of distance monitoring, of leading better lives, more aware lives. OM Signal is a Montreal company that has developed a biometric shirt, so that's one of the platforms for that. I is for interaction. Is that right? Did I get it right? Okay, yeah. So this is a wonderful piece by Benaz Farahi, which is the caress of the gaze. So the garment actually reacts to your presence. To your looking at it, it responds like an animal who might sort of like shiver and move around. So how do we create conversations that are, you know, completely visual, completely kinetic? A whole new platform for that. J is for jewelry. So, you know, beyond gadget, which might appeal to more of a kind of male sector, jewelry, they've really tried to kind of market jewelry accessories. So again, we're back on the wrist, but we're looking at how can it be a luxury item, and there's tons of this out there. K is for knitting. Knitting is a really important part of developing smart fabrics, smart textiles, and new ways of producing fashion tech. Nike developed its Flyknit running shoe, which is all made of one piece, so zero waste. So kind of like an interesting direction. L is for laboratory, where we make things, and we've discussed this a little bit so far, is really key to what will be made. It was, you know, one of the chapters in my dissertation is really looking at these epistemic cultures and how the laboratory shapes the outcome. Not just the tools, but the culture, the philosophy, the ideas behind it. Autodesk Pier 9, so Autodesk, which started as a software company, is going into the real world. That should give us kind of an idea that there's a big shift in terms of digital media. We're going into fabrication. And Pier 9 is one of the key places where a lot of emergent wearable tech is being developed in this state-of-the-art laboratory makerspace. M is for maker. So we all know what that is, and it's really key to propelling the field. N is for nanotech. It's perhaps a field that's less accessible to the everyday maker, but it's a field that is impacting the shape of things to come. So this is Auger Loiseau, a kind of speculative design. Would you be willing to have a telephone in an implanted tooth? You know, a provocation, like how far are we willing to go in terms of wearable tech? Will we wear it inside our bodies? O is for open design. So a lot of e-textiles, a lot of fashion tech production is being done because we have new platforms that are accessible, that they're open to many people. This is LilyPad Arduino, developed by Leah Buckley, who's now at the High-Low Tech lab at MIT. But this is stuff that any kid can buy on the internet and make themselves. And so it really, you know, gives an opportunity for people to have a conversation, to be part of that conversation. And these are some of my works that have used that platform as democratizing that field in an aesthetic way. P is for performance. There are so many ways in which computerized fashion can be a platform for expression. This is the wonderful work of Chicks on Speed. They essentially have really capitalized on creating instruments. In this case, this is Alex Murray's work. So she's created instrument shoes that one can perform with. So transforming our idea of the instrument, the body, and fashion all in one swoop. Q is for quality versus quantity, because we sort of have two spectrums that are both happening in fashion and technology. Do we want something refined, something bespoke, or are we just going to go the way of more is better? And this happens both in technology and both in fashion. There's a kind of an alarming overflow of products that we probably don't want on our planet, truth be told. R is for rapid prototyping. So how can 3D printing technologies create new forms, new shapes, new designs? This is the work of Francis Bittanti. He just spoke at the White House about design. I mean, like, how cool is that? That, you know, all of a sudden things are moving forward. And I'm sure any moment now we'll be speaking to Justin. This is based on cellular automata and how do you create a shoe in combination with 3D printing and the effects of it. This is Dita Von Teese and a beautiful dress, we can't see the video, that really moves organically, so we can build for the whole body. S is for storytelling. If these objects don't tell stories, then perhaps they really don't have meaning in our worlds. So this is an early piece that I made based on Charles Perrault's fairy tale called Podane, in which the protagonist asks for impossible dresses. This one is made of the sky, so it's networked with a weather vane that blows up and fills up the dress, all depending on local data information. T is for textiles, or smart textiles in this case. So this is conductive embroidered thread that creates a circuit. So we have threads that have silver or conductive components. This is done in collaboration with Foster Rohner, a textile company that normally makes lace for Dior, but now they're making fashion tech. U is for, what did I say? It was hard to come up, for user, okay. There's a few that I had to kind of, jam in there. User interfaces. This is the fun work of Tiffany Trenda, who's looking at how do you relate with an audience in terms of wearable technology? So she creates, this one has sensor pads that people can access. So she kind of becomes an avatar who is a real person and you can interact with her. In this piece, Ubiquitous States, she takes your pulse, so you touch her, you don't see her face, but then you interact with a human being that is a bit kind of robot, cybernetic, and you have a new kind of user relationship. V is for visualization. So LEDs, screens, why not? They're on garments. This was the work of Cute Circuit with a Twitter, was it a Twitter app? I think so, that could visualize Twitter feeds. And the work of Moritz Waldemar, who creates, for a lot of these like boy bands, these LED garments. So, like Bono and Take That can have these funky jackets. W is for waste. Every time someone asks me, so wow, amazing, fashion tech is going to save the world, I just immediately think of how incompatible that vision is with the kind of waste that we're creating. We're basically putting electronics into textiles, which is something that should be recyclable, and we're making it not recyclable. So obviously this is something that we'll have to to think about in the extremely near future. Extreme environments drives a, sweaty finger here. Hold on. Okay, is driving a lot of research. This is a wonderful spacesuit developed by Neva Newman from MIT to look at how a three-dimensional spacesuit could make for a more ergonomic experience for space travel. And I love that they tested it out on a woman. I guess maybe their argument was like, they're more curvy, so I don't know, you know. I think it's still, it's a platform that always has a good argument, firefighters, space travel, so on and so forth. I'm almost at the end. Y is for you. So how do you fit into that space? And this is a wonderful musical shoe made by Ricardo Onascimento. And Z, which got a little bit slipped around there, is for big data. So we can be sure that why big companies want to, sell you wearables is that they have access to a whole new data set. There we go, A to Z. Thanks very much.
Yeah, you weren't kidding when you said diversity of perspectives. So there's a lot to take in there, and I will just add two more A words, though, because when we talk about making and the potential and the areas that we're starting to explore, I think we always have to also think about authenticity and appropriation, which in various ways I think are very large debates within all three of the areas that you're talking about. So I just throw that out there as well. And I will open, do we have a microphone that can go around to people asking questions? Yes, we do. Okay. Is there any questions you would like to ask each other first?
I just want to pick up on that idea of authenticity because I'm interested. I think authenticity and craft are both terms and ideas that come out of the Enlightenment. And that search for something authentic to define how people were feeling in the Industrial Revolution. So I think it's interesting that in our technological revolution, it's resurging as a point of reference. So, I mean, appropriation is a whole other huge discussion, but I'm just thinking of the authentic because it's being misappropriated just as words around craft are. And it's interesting with the rise of technology, whether you're encountering that in your research, because what is authentic today becomes something people are really after.
Absolutely. I mean, and to kind of, I think that it would be interesting because you were able to bring up some very kind of fundamental questions about, let's say, the authenticity of craft or the place of craft within this kind of technological milieu where we're kind of maybe on board. I would suggest that in fashion tech or in architecture and design, people are trying to find ways to associate with technology. They're trying to kind of bring technology into the foreground, I would suggest, in lots of interesting ways. And this question coming from your side, the idea that technology might be suppressed in order to develop ideas about craft and authenticity or place, I think is really interesting. So how one maybe, how could there be so much, let's say, hype about technology in some disciplines and in a way, a kind of necessity for its suppression in others? It's very, maybe you could comment on that because those ideas I think are very provocative. This what were you calling it? Craft washing?
Craft washing. Well, it's interesting because and Valerie, I interviewed you. Yeah.
Bubbling up. But go ahead.
Well, I've been teaching craft history for 17 years now. And it was about 5 years ago that my students stopped caring about technology. The debates used to be so intense that people would storm out of the classroom, yelling and screaming at each other about computers are going to be the death of craft, and people were really worked up about it. And it was about 5 years ago that, I would say to a class the very same kind of question I thought was provocative, and they'd be like, so? So it is interesting how I think we're at a tipping point. What I see happening that I think is disingenuous is how corporations, and that's yes. That to me, when you're talking about the makers, it's a different discussion than when you're talking about the corporations. And Valerie,
I like to look at while I was researching my dissertation, I looked a lot at fashion, which I didn't really have much of a kind of theoretical framework for it. And it was amazing, like not only is there the coincidence that the idea of fashion, like the idea not just stylistically, but that you have a fashion designer, a voice, a label, emerges exactly at the same time as the technological revolution, you know? So there are a lot of things that happen there that push and pull. So one of my case studies is Paul Poiret, and he's like the first kind of like media sensation persona. And he would have these big harem parties, these theme parties, and he'd do photo shoots and films. I mean, he's really like this multimedia designer artist, you know? I mean, he's doing everything that like Karl Lagerfeld maybe does for, you know, Chanel in being a photographer and a muse and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there was this anxiety around authenticity because people started copying. The moment that things, you know, got into the sort of the popular hands, what would happen is he'd travel to New York, have trunk shows, and then people would copy his pieces. So there began the idea, in terms of DIY, it's super interesting, of the pattern, the official authorized pattern. So this is an official copy of a Paul Poiret. So he had lawyers and copyright. And so these thoughts have been with us for a long time. And of course, they also converge in the world of technology, but in terms of craft and making. And then just a final note on fashion is that even to this day, we have these extreme polar opposites of like incredible revolutionary technologies of textiles and making hand in hand with exploitation of labor or high-end fashion couture where everything is handmade and hand embroidered. And that the spectrum is still just so huge. It fascinates me to this day that we have not resolved that for us economically or socially or even conceptually in terms of what do we want in that, from that space.
Just wanted to make a comment, like a parallel comment, because we are sort of, maybe there's these parallel disciplines that one can sort of identify historical precedents in. And certainly architects in the 20th century, the really important modernist ones, Le Corbusier and others, were trying to produce a kind of industrially driven architecture that was built on mass production that would be sort of for everybody's use. There would be all of these, really the focus was on the kind of commonalities in and around a translation to industrial production. Nowadays, with the advent of the kinds of technologies that we're working with today, the arguments have been around what people are calling on the design side, like mass customization, where you can, you know, make short runs of elements that might be in buildings or in products or parts or whatever that are unique. But that's even spilled over now into, from sort of software to hardware, you can start to set out design kind of applets or routines that any person can go and use to produce a unique artifact and then with 3D printing make it themselves or have it made. So that there's this kind of broadening of the kind of, let's say, agency in that technology has created, and whether that's a crisis, I think it could be a crisis if one's trying to make a definition of craft.
But I'm just, I like,
everybody can make that.
But Tom, I like your point because Le Corbusier and that idea of standardization, there's a utopian romantic vision of that when you read Le Corbusier, you're like, oh, you're going to bulldoze the center of Paris. That's not a good idea. But, you know, with hindsight, I think we're doing a similar thing today, right? This idea that technology for all, it's utopian, we can help the world. But what's interesting about the hand, just coming back to the hand, Hermann Matthesius was writing about that as early as 1907 and romanticizing the iron hand. The Germans were calling it the iron hand because the iron hand was not separate from the machinery that was frightening people, but it was part of the machinery. So it's so interesting to read Matthesius over a century ago, who's articulating the very same thoughts we're using today, but we're just using different terminology. But it's the very same idea that machines, you know, this idea of biometrics is going to improve your life, the world will standardize, we're all after the same kind of ideals. So, you know, it's interesting, like we're still trying to deal with that idea of authenticity, romanticization, technology, but we just have a different set of tools we're using.
I have a question. Someone gave me the mic.
A voice in the...
Yeah, exactly, a voice.
We have a question.
Well, it was a bit about going back to the idea of language And you talked a bit about craft washing, and I wondered if maybe starting with you, but also from other disciplines as well, if you see kind of almost like a battle for language between a kind of co-opting of language and then trying to find new language to somehow identify what you're doing as a practitioner or as you were showing, this kind of idea of bespoke, and these words come up that then get, let's say, co-opted or at least popularized to a point where they become almost meaningless, and then you have to find suddenly, as a practitioner, a new way to describe that. You've seen that sort of cycle happen, but are you also seeing it in these other disciplines as well?
I'll just briefly start. You are 100% right. In fact, there's a new campaign that's been, well, it's a year old now. It's been launched by Craft Ontario and the Canadian Craft Federation. It's called Citizens of Craft. It's a campaign with a manifesto. For that reason, exactly, Ryan, the word craft being co-opted wholesale by corporations and really being abused in terms of how it's being applied, is of deep concern to professional craftspeople, because, you know, on the one hand, the general public is becoming indoctrinated with words like artisanal, but then on the other hand, they're like, what does this mean, right? Like, artisanal bread is everywhere being mass produced. So the Citizens of Craft campaign is about the word, and it's about taking the word back. And it's interesting because we have designed it to align with words like local, global, or local, organic, fair trade. So that sense of ownership. So it's interesting when you enter into policy making around words. That's very, gets really political and really interesting.
Absolutely. So it was Mika Satomi, who is kind of a textile engineer, and at a conference once, because they think a lot about craft, they had this wonderful website called How to Get What You Want, which is a lot of craft examples of making electronic components and sensors. And she pointed out, or at least her argument was that all of this anxiety around craft is probably because we suck at it more than ever. And which is maybe partly true. I mean, when I look at the sweaters that my 92-year-old grandma made, without thought or concern as to where it fit into the world, where everyone knew how to knit, how to bake, how to artisanal this and craft that, without having to name it. So this hyper anxiety around probably the loss of that is maybe what is making it resurge. So I don't know, maybe that's sort of counter, but I would argue that when I ask my day-to-day students to craft something, I'm sometimes astounded at how low the bar is for them in terms of what they consider. I mean, they just consider the fact that they made it by hand to be like,
enough, yeah.
So in my field, that's how I've seen it.
I have that trouble with my own kids. They're like, oh, Dad, isn't this a great drawing? And I'm like, that's really but teaching undergraduates in architecture, which I've done for many, many, many years, we're really, I've been doing it long enough that there's a kind of a generation of students, the ones that were kind of coming into schools in the early 2000s, they actually had some hand drawing skills. We would, like, with authority, give them, tasks about making models. Representation in architecture really is about the drawing and the model making, these various accoutrements to the design process that have been time honored over many years. And suddenly those things are giving way. Like the students, not only can they not, they can't write with a pen anymore. They can't do cursive. They cannot really cut a straight line with an X-Acto knife. There's all these things that they can't do, and yet they're, it's very interesting because we're in this kind of ether where I think we're at the center of a kind of maelstrom, and there may be that some agreed upon techniques will arise out of this period that we're in, or maybe not. Just a quick comment, because again, coming from the design side, more on the kind of theoretical side, trying to address this question of craft and authenticity, there seems to be a kind of moment that we're in where multidisciplinarity has become, not everyone wants it, but it's inevitable, it seems, in the face of these tools that a lot of different people can have access to and use in different ways. And so I'm noticing on the professional architecture side at the Ontario Association of Architects, they're kind of panicking because the purvey of architects is now giving way to these kinds of things given these new tools that a lot of other people can do. And as an architect with my architect hat, I'd say, oh, but we're professionals, we've been trained, you need to listen to us, and nobody's really listening, and they're becoming irrelevant, and they may or may not be in the discussion at all. And in the meantime, terms like bespoke, vernacular, there's in my more immediate world of design and technology, there's always, I mentioned one guy, James Stevens, his book is called Digital Vernacular. And really predictably, it's very interesting, but it's like how there's this essential importance in this term, this word, the vernacular, and we can co-opt it in a certain way. And I don't think it's necessary to use that term vernacular for what he was talking about as far as unpacking and repacking laser cutters and 3D printers. I don't know. And the other term that you mentioned and that's come up and absolutely comes up constantly in the fashion side is the bespoke. Maybe 5 years ago, everything was like the architecture of the bespoke, and like, oh, are we doing bespoke buildings now? Like, what's your inseam? Because we need I'm not sure whether we're not, like, let's say, in a kind of a maelstrom where these people are trying on all these things, or whether or if some new order might emerge out of this.
Yeah.
Well, I spoke with Ryan a few days ago, and I did mention that my whole dissertation argument was actually completely counter to this morning's topic, which was the approach that I took was non-linguistic, because this sort of notion that inscriptions could really frame what's happening right now seemed to me to be problematic. So of course, I still used words, but in this case, no, I did a performance, but I used the word performance, which is being used a lot in science, technology, and society, and the research, what kind of sociological research of laboratory cultures to describe what happens in laboratories. And so people like Andrew Pickering, Karin Norstetina, Karen Barad, looking at ways in which you can explain what happens in the laboratory as a human, non-human performance. And that perhaps that can provide us with a different lens or a different understanding of that framework, which is not really cemented in one idea, but really unfolding over time, and also unfolding over the negotiation of the agency of like materials. So anyone who's a maker, we know, it's hard to get that thing to do what you want it to do, versus, our kind of like framework of where we want to go with it. So how do you negotiate, the agency of like, a stone or a conductive wire, or a textile versus your agency as a maker to enact that vision? And maybe because mass customization is something that's like brought up a lot in fashion tech and the future of retail, we'll all just go and pick out what we want and we'll all have bespoke this and that, although of course they're kind of like cookie cutter templates. But maybe there's a different framework in which we can better understand what's happening in terms of that negotiation, and that it's a lot more confusing and messy than we give it credit for when we like have it with this kind of web screen or web interface that simplifies it.
And I just want to, that idea of customization and ownership, I want to go back to the point Stephen made earlier about appropriation. We were talking at breakfast about this because I'm also seeing where the students no longer are interested in a really raucous debate about technology. Increasingly, there are levels of cross-cultural appropriation happening that shock me. So, part of what's happening with the bespoke customization is a sense of global ownership. So if I want to use an indigenous motif, it doesn't matter that I'm not, Algonquin, I'm just going to use it. So it becomes, to me, back to Ryan's point about, staking claim over words like craft, it's also very interesting as those things morph out, so do certain cultural forms of appropriation. And every once in a while, there'll be a slap on the hand like Urban Outfitters using the Navajo pattern. But more often than not, it's interesting because I'm just thinking, I think it was Adidas did that line of Maori wear, and that was part of their new technology line. So it gets all messed up.
Just before I open it up to the audience, I do want to thank Tom for really introducing, an unexplored topic in art history, and that is the critique of refrigerator art. And I think that that's its own symposium. So anybody who wants to take that one on, I'm in there. You know,
Like in the refrigerator.
yeah, it's like the ones you put on there by your kids. It's like, no, I really want to get at the heart of that. So, sorry, because that was a really interesting discussion. I had to take out that little bit that just appealed to me personally. So I'll open it up for other questions.
Bonjour, je suis Brigitte. It's not matured, so it's going to be very confused questions, so I hope that's okay. I come from the other side of the digital, which is the online and virtual, and I work in virtual museums and virtual exhibits, and everything that you've talked about is anchored in the physical. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts. You alluded to the dress, which was a Twitter dress, which maybe bridges towards the virtual. But do you have any thoughts about those blended experiences? And for example, in museums and in exhibits, we do a lot of blended experiences where you will have something physical that people can experience, designed by designers, by architects, etc., that is also available online. And online, there's the sidebar of co-creation of, the Rijksmuseum in Holland does a wonderful work with your own studio, so you co-create artwork. So I know I'm going in different directions, but it's that I'm a little surprised that there was nothing about digital, the other side of digital, which is digital products, and there's a lot of work being done in the digital world online.
Well, I think... Oh,
there you go. So I will articulate my question better for later.
But this whole problem of authenticity and appropriation, I would argue that some of it has to do with the fact that so much production is virtually made. So fashion designers rely on, as architects, I assume, but you correct me if I'm wrong, like very sophisticated algorithms that will kind of like, produce the garment that they need, and then it gets sent off to a mysterious place, and then it comes back as a fully formed thing without many questions asked. So that's one aspect of virtual, which I think is a detriment to craft to a certain extent, but then it is a new door opening. So I don't know. I mean, I'm of two minds about it, because there's a company called, I think it's actually called Unmade. It's a knitting company that's a startup in the UK, and you can kind of have a customized knitwear and an interface, and it's artists. So there's a lot of nice initiatives. The second thing I would say about virtual is that the whole retail space, in terms of how we consume fashion and products, is about to go in that direction. So we've seen people never thought they would buy stuff on the internet. I remember, of course, now we buy a lot of things on the internet, and so we're looking at interfacing how that experience can be augmented and how we can be more fully situated in that space in terms of, let's say, fashion consumers or other kinds of consumers, and how the store space, let's say in terms of fashion, will become more experiential than really about shopping. So it will be more about visualization, about situating yourself. So there's a whole research around that that's really big, and it's happening now. So
I would agree. It's a really large topic area, and it tends to kind of reside in parallel to the discussion that, let's say, from this panel or this conference is coming from the perspective of making, and let's say the spaces of making, et cetera, and trying to deal with the implications of this sort of digital world that we now live in. But just a couple of comments about that. And again, this isn't so much what we were focusing on, but there are now increasingly accessible kind of AR or augmented reality environments. So I had a chance with a graduate course I was teaching at Waterloo to experience this HTC vibe, this kind of working interface where you're actually in a kind of digital room, and you have these tools that are unbelievable tools, but just the programs. So I was working in this thing, was kind of like Photoshop, but you could make these objects in and around your body. It was really magical. And so these interfaces are they are literally coming on stream at a really rapid pace and are going to I suppose they're really going to change everything. But that's one side. So the idea that I made a brief mention of it in having to stage and set out these maker spaces. I've resolved, and I hope Remco and his group here at Argent Engine do the same, to make it such that the fabrication lab shouldn't just be for making prototypes and artifacts, but rather it should be a kind of quasi-immersive space. And there's certain things that we're looking at technically over at Ryerson to do that, like a ceiling grid and blackout blinds and things like that. And there's some level things, because a big KUKA robot, it's on a track, and so if there was a performance, they might trip over the track if they're trying to dance with the robot or whatever. But the idea that it could be interesting that these types of preoccupations could start to converge. And then lastly, the guy that I also mentioned, this sort of really high-end facade design person, he had no problem with the reality that there would be thousands of people beavering away in remote locations on kind of common files in order to produce these really complex geometries for a building that none of the people working on it might ever really see. So they wouldn't be drawing one line, but rather they're working in a kind of a coding environment to do properties for components. And so I think in a way, there's if the step from these various disciplines and terminologies towards some kind of common agendas around craft and making and technology is a small step. There's the step towards this broader thing, that this kind of AI that we're going to be faced with in the next number of years, about how we really deal with the digital when it really becomes more profound and pronounced is really difficult. And just very lastly, Edward Bertinsky's running a lab out of what Ryerson called the Think to Thing, and he's again bringing all of his expertise around images and image capture to the creation of artifacts. And so his group, Think to Thing, are having conferences, and they're talking to curators, and they're discussing these sort of hybrid, physical replication artifacts for museums, and then they're digital libraries where those things are going to also exist, and that's also very interesting. But again, coming from the making side, those guys as well.
I'm so glad you brought up the kind of curatorial aspect of things, because I think with craft, especially ceramics, for example, it's always been displayed under glass. So that idea of not being able to interface with an object is just part of museum history. So this idea of new technologies opens up, I think, some really exciting avenues. And I know it's frustrating whenever I curate a show and then you've got this amazing object that you can handle, and all of a sudden it's on a plinth and then the glass is placed over you. So like you're saying, the possibility of doing a digital fabrication of something relatively cheaply and relatively quickly that people can handle,
full color too,
is amazing. And then online to be able to go in the round. I cannot believe how exciting it is to go into museum collections and then see objects at the bottom, the top, in the round, and then to have access to those images for teaching. I love it. I think it's amazing what's happening.
It's becoming very sophisticated, or really not sophisticated, but it's really going into very interesting.
Yes.
But that has its real challenges as well. I mean, certainly a new area of legal scholarship is around how does this exist, this object made completely digitally, and because certainly our copyright laws have not kept up to this.
No.
So this is an area that is going to have to be dealt with. At what point do you become the maker? Do you hold some kind of copyright? And then we get into authenticity and appropriation, because can I just copy something that already exists? What does it become then? And then you also get, around the whole interacting completely in the digital environment. So we've had legal cases about people interacting on Second Life with, so there was divorce cases that were involved in this, and at what point does this person you create, it's just a fascinating area, but no government wants to touch it. And so it's leading to difficulties for museums and galleries, especially because they have to be very careful of those kind of topics. But that's a whole area of real interest.
What's interesting about the idea of handling in the museum is that if you could imitate, replicate an object that is generally unhandleable, and then suddenly everybody can handle it, what is the authentic experience of the object? Is the authentic experience reside in being able to handle and experience the object and maybe even use it, or does it reside when it's an original? So these ideas of originality can be subverted with all kinds of ways. But I'm leading us off into we're going to wrap up in a few minutes.
Yeah, that's right, Walter Benjamin.
Benjamin and photograph and the aura. So that's nothing new, really. We've always been able to reproduce, and how has that impacted the object? So it's not just a digital.
Sure. We're going to wrap up in a minute because people need a break and then we'll need to come back. So I will let the panel have a little moment to wrap up.
I was going to say, kids, they scanned, wasn't it Nefertiti's head? And then they printed her in 3D. And so I was going to say it's happening. And then I think it's about where you position yourself. So the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam was closed for a long time, reopened. And every single artifact in the museum is open, free of use of any use, period. Whereas most museums that I go to now in Canada, all of a sudden, I can't take photos anymore. I used to go with my son, and our game was to, we would stage performance installations in front of art pieces and photograph ourselves, and a way of interacting with the artwork. And now we've locked that down. So I don't know which is better, but the debate is on, that's for sure, in terms of our relationship with these objects from a museum standpoint. Anyhow.
I just wanted to wrap up by saying, I think these questions of authenticity in objects are fascinating, but I also wanted to just make a bit of a summary comment or pitch for the evolution of these technology-enabled spaces, and I think Valerie's comment earlier that there's terms that we use and we sometimes misuse or we try to keep defining by discussions like this. There's the terminology, but in a sense, what we demonstrate or what we show or what people can experience, I think, is really stands for a lot. And so what I've been really advocating for at Ryerson and in my teaching is to not only, I talk a ton and I'm constantly talking, but the fact is there's the artifacts themselves. Generally speaking, when I give a lecture about technology and these new enabling spaces, I bring a bunch of artifacts. I should have brought some today. 3D prints, various pieces of models, et cetera, that start to become a bit more exemplary finally, or are good in addition to whatever terms or words are being used to start to describe the outputs, et cetera. And I think it's increasingly important. One of my technicians at Design Fabrication Zone, who went off to do a PhD at Princeton, he went to sort of, to pursue his own career, but he was very preoccupied with the kind of setting up of the lab so that when people come through, they can get a kind of feel for what you're doing, a little bit under the hood or behind the scenes. And I thought that was really inauthentic for a while, but then I started to realize that, in fact, that's quite important. When I worked brief for a period of time in the late 90s at Frank Gehry's office, and at that time his office was in Santa Monica, under one roof. There were constantly tours of interested parties and dignitaries and famous people being kind of paraded through the place to see what we were doing. And what we were doing in that office was literally building these gigantic, amazing, kind of messy models, scale model artifacts of these projects. And so for me, the part of my mandate, and I think what's really important is, we have to continue to kind of define the terminology, but as things change, and they're changing very quickly, I think should keep an eye on being demonstrative, not only of the final products or spaces that we're creating, but rather the kind of techniques and the workflows that are kind of going into those, and trying to be as transparent about those as possible, I think is really key so people can understand.
And I just want to finish with the idea of back to the hand and skill. I mean, I love these debates, but I think the fact that will never change is that when somebody's really a skilled maker, no matter what technology you're using, you'll still blow people's minds. That's what they want to come and see. That's what they're going to respond to. So, whether we can figure out a way to make it leap from the digital world into our real world or not, when somebody makes something and is skilled at it, you still get so excited.
Well, I want to thank Sandra, Tom, and Valerie. It's been a wonderful conversation. I hope it continues on during the day. Thank you to everybody for your questions and for listening. And I think we'll have a little break now and then come back for the second panel. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.